Hi, everyone. My name is Jesse Robbins, and welcome to LPLE from Dialogue FM. We're the podcast that lets you practice listening in English. We speak English slowly and clearly so that you can follow along and understand native English speakers more easily. I'm excited to help you improve your English listening skill, as well as help you learn new vocabulary, grammar, and idioms commonly heard in conversations among native English speakers. If you want to practice listening in English, then we invite you to join our conversation. Hi, Jane.
Hi, Jesse.
I just found out today that we have some new listeners from French-speaking parts of Europe, which is very exciting. I want to welcome them to listening to LPLE, but what better way to welcome them than in French?
Bienvenue à nos nouveaux auditeurs francophones. Nous sommes ravis de vous accueillir.
I always found the French language to be absolutely beautiful. So thank you very much for helping me listen to some beautiful French language. How long did you study French?
I can't count the years. I started in junior high, and by the time I was through high school, I was able to skip the college classes, not college classes, but the beginning classes. By the time I finished university, I had actually majored in French, and I was almost fluent, but certain things killed me when I actually went to France. Face-to-face conversations were easy, but the radio and the telephone were a nightmare. It took about a year, even though I was quite fluent, to be really comfortable listening.
That is a perfect introduction to today's topic of context. So, what is context? Just so that when we use the word context, people know what we mean. When I think of context, I think of background information.
I think of background information in the sense of, I think, two senses. One is, what is the current situation? Why are these people talking to each other? What's going on? And also, what is it that we already have planted in our minds from a long time ago? Just as a tiny example, yesterday I had a class where the word Pearl Harbor was mentioned. And the students in the class were young enough not to really understand the reference. So the whole rest of the conversation was lost on them because they just didn't happen to have the background knowledge. They understood the words, but none of it signified to them the meaning of Second World War.
When you mentioned that you learned French and you could speak it comfortably, you could speak French pretty fluently, you still had trouble listening to the radio and the television. I had a very similar experience with the Japanese language. Even now, like you, I could have face-to-face, one-on-one conversation with my friend, no problem. However, when I would listen to the radio, or now podcasts, or when I watched movies in Japanese or television shows in Japanese, it would be very difficult. It's also difficult when I'm in a large group of people, right? So let's say you're at a party. Your friend brings you to a party, and you are the international student. And your friend introduces you to a circle of her friends, and they're all talking about something already. So you say, hello, I'm Jane, nice to meet you, I'm from America. And oh, nice to meet you, Jane, welcome. And then they continue talking about the previous conversation. They continue the previous conversation. Now, you, Jane, you understand French. However, because you don't know the context, sometimes understanding that conversation is difficult.
That's right. Both in terms of why they're talking about it. I might not know the who, what, when, where, why. But this is the crazy part. Sometimes even sentences or words that I would normally understand if I did have context don't register with me. They don't stick, so to speak. It's interesting, but it's as if my brain weren't prepared to receive them. And I see this also with my English language students. They may understand the words, but they don't come together in a meaningful sentence. And I find that even though I've spoken French almost all my life, that can happen to me too.
I feel that is going to be a challenge that many people learning the English language, many of our listeners are going to face that challenge a lot, especially if they don't live in America or Canada or England or Australia or Singapore. Mm-hmm. Because they're not listening to the English language every day, it's going to be very difficult for them to quickly understand the context, right? So in my case, I always imagine it as if I'm always trying to catch up, right? The funny thing is, in a conversation, like English conversation, I like to talk, so I like to reply or respond to someone's comment really quickly. Sometimes with a joke or sometimes with an interesting data point, fact, something. However, when I'm listening to my friends speak in Japanese, my brain is usually 5 seconds behind. So by the time that I've created my response, they've already changed to a new topic. Does that happen to you?
It does. And I'm a little similar in the sense that partly out of what I consider to be good manners and partly just out of my personal preference, I like to respond quickly also, partly to show that I agreed or am interested, and partly just because I like to talk too. I don't really have a solution for the problem of finding yourself in a foreign situation other than to stay very friendly, to laugh when it seems like the right time, and to admit if I get stuck, if somebody asks me my opinion, I sometimes have to say, I'm a little behind, I missed this, that, and the other. I actually sometimes have to admit it. Most of the time, I just say, I'll understand this better at the end, and I'll have to be my quiet, friendly self instead of my talkative, friendly self. And I do learn something that way.
I agree. See, in that situation, I noticed that many of my international friends feel sad, right?
Right.
So they've, for example, I've heard many of my Japanese friends say this, which is, I've studied English for many years, and I've been in America for 1 or 2 years, and I still cannot understand a native English conversation. And I noticed that they look really sad and frustrated and discouraged and disappointed. those feelings of being sad, frustrated, disappointed, and discouraged actually make it more difficult to understand the English language, right? So in that regard, the reason why I'm glad you and I are talking about this and sharing our experience, your experience learning French and listening in French and living in France, and then my experience learning Japanese, listening in Japanese, and living in Japan, I want our listeners to know that this is very normal, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
This experience is 100% normal.
Nobody should ever think there's something wrong with them individually because they're having that kind of problem. I agree with you. It's universal.
That's right. And now the biggest challenge, I think, is understanding context and recognizing that it's okay if you don't understand the context, the background information, because you weren't there for the conversation and your vocabulary is probably still limited. This is okay. And Jane, your solutions about listening and just paying attention and trying to be polite, you're practicing other skills as well, right?
Yes, and observing body language is very helpful, actually. Sometimes that actually gets you farther than having understood the actual words, I think. So I just want to say, watch every clue. And above all, as you said, don't feel that it's something wrong with you. Take it as just another learning exercise.
We are always going to be learning French and Japanese and English for the rest of our lives. There's no end point. There's no finish line. There's no day when we can say that we have mastered our language. So if we can just forget that,
Yes.
just forget that we have a goal, right? That there's some end, and just use every opportunity to learn something new, hopefully that will make the experience of learning English and listening in English more comfortable, right?
Yes.
Now, one of the things I noticed, this happened to me with my American friends. So we'll be at a Japanese restaurant, and I will hear people speak in Japanese, and my friends will say, "Oh, you understand Japanese? What are they saying?" I hate that. I hate that question. Because one, that's a lot of pressure, right? You have to immediately listen to other people's conversation, and it's probably a private conversation, right? And furthermore, like, I could probably understand words, but I won't understand the context. You know, they could be saying, "Yeah, I bought milk at a grocery store," but I don't know if it's because they needed to eat cereal, or if they just really like milk, or they needed to buy milk in order to bake a cake at home. So there's context that I don't understand. So I could probably tell my friends, "Oh, you know, they said this, and this," but I couldn't give them the context. It's very difficult for me to just listen to a random conversation and understand everything.
Oh, absolutely. Even frankly, in my native language, English, would have trouble unless they were sitting right next to me and it were a quiet restaurant. But what I probably could do in English, which I wouldn't necessarily be able to be sure about in French, I might hear a woman say, and he did blah, blah, and he did blah, blah, in English, and I could probably say, she's talking about a problem with her boyfriend. Okay? In French, I wouldn't be 100% sure that the clues I was thinking I heard were right. Whereas in English, I can make that interpretation, partly from context and partly just from all the little subtle clues that we come to understand in the ways that people say things. So I could never summarize what happened at the next table in French.
Right. Now, when we think about a movie or when we think about entering into a conversation that's already happening, I think that in English, we typically say, oh, what's going on? What's happening for a movie, right? So you come in, you enter a movie halfway and your friend will say, oh, this happened. This is happening. That's context. And same thing with a conversation. You enter into a conversation and you can ask, oh, so what were you talking about? And then someone will quickly say, oh, we were talking about our time in graduate school. Oh, okay. You know what's interesting? We don't do that in a foreign language. I think
we're embarrassed.
We're embarrassed. That's it. We're too afraid to say, oh, what's happening? Or, oh, what were you talking about? Why do you think that is?
I think for me that despite having lived with French people, having worked with French people, having lived in France for a long time, there are tiny nuances of politeness that I'm never 100% sure about. So I know how to say the words, what were you talking about, in French, but I don't know for sure what degree of, oh, I'm sorry to interrupt, blah, 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 what kind of politeness language would be right. Whereas in English, I know, what's this about? Or, I would know exactly the tone of voice to use so that I wouldn't be considered intrusive or rude. And I'm never 100% sure in French. How about you in Japanese?
That's a great question. And admittedly, I think I play the foreigner card.
Yes, me too sometimes.
Right? So it's 100% clear that I am not Japanese.
Well, it's about 85 to 80% sure with me, too, that I'm not French.
So, granted, I can speak Japanese well enough to have a comfortable conversation. There are some times when I have to be open and say, and take the risk and take the chance that I could be making in English we say social faux pas, right?
Yes.
So what is a social faux pas? It means breaking a social rule of politeness.
Yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I could be breaking a social rule of politeness by asking, oh, so what were you talking about? Or what's happening? And I think because I'm a foreigner, people might be understanding and sympathetic. I just hope so. That's my hope. Yeah.
Me too. And it's interesting you say that because now that I'm older and more experienced, I am more likely to play the foreigner card. But when I went to France, I was in my early 20s and I wanted to fit in and be French. And I think that was the dumbest thing I ever did. It was good because I did have wonderful experiences, but I hindered myself. Now first of all, my accent now is probably stronger in French than it was then. So people know I'm foreign. And now I don't care. I like you say, I play the foreigner card and everybody's very nice about it.
It's interesting that as we get older, we stop caring about what people think.
Yeah.
Not that we want to be rude. We don't want to be rude. But we also don't let what people think of us determine what we do. So for all of our listeners, especially our younger listeners in the teenage years or early college years, don't worry. Just don't worry. Don't worry about what people think. Have fun. Recognize context matters. If you don't know the context, maybe ask.
Simple, but not easy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of LPLE. Let's practice listening in English from Dialogue FM. Subscribe to LPLE on iTunes to hear the latest episodes, or listen to past episodes on our website, dialogue.fm. That's dialog.fm. If you have questions or comments about English, or if you would like for us to use a word, grammar, or idiom in our conversation so you can learn how to use it correctly, we would love to hear from you on Twitter at dialogue.fm or Facebook at facebook.com/dialoguefm.